Hello, everyone. This is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. This will be the last episode I do for a couple of weeks. I'm going to take a break and I will resume in September. I'll give notifications on both the community post and Twitter for more information. You can follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. You can support me on Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and Locals, as well as on Substack. And remember, continued support keeps this show going. All right. Democracy as a historical phenomena, February 21st, 2008. What do you want to bet? This is actually nothing about democracy as a historical phenomena. What do you want to bet, Logos?
Well, I mean, if the previous ones have been anything to go by recently, it's a good bet. I don't know if I want to bet against you on that one.
Yeah, I know. Elections are weird. Then again, so is American football. If we imagine defending either to Hans Adam 2, perhaps we have to start on how hard it is to see democracy as a part of history. To explain anything as a part of history is to explain it as foreign. When modern historians talk about the Bourbons or the Habsburgs, they can be pretty sure there are no Bourbons, Habsburgs, or rabid partisans of either in the room. No one is about to hound them out of a job for omitting Louis XIV style as the most Christian king or any other act of la majesty. Perhaps Professor Hindley's offense could be seen as a sort of les démocratie. It is easy to explain monarchy as a historical phenomenon because we all know that monarchy is weird. And so, of course, it is, although not perhaps as weird as we were raised to think. The ruler of Sharjah has just displayed His Highness's boundless wisdom in appointing a distant relative of mine to a distinguished academic position. So I'm feeling pretty good about hereditary government at the moment. Our great obstacle is thinking critically about democracy is the fact that everything we know about politics and government reassures us that democracy is, while certainly not perfect, the best possible system of government. As I suggested the other week, questioning this tradition on its own terms is about as likely to work as disproving God via biblical scholarship. Specifically, demotism is inseparable from the Whig theory of history, in which history is a sort of political forms evolving, great chain of being style towards our present perfection. If democracy is bunk, so is Whig history. But if Whig history is bunk, what isn't? Is there a Tory theory of history? And if so, should we just subscribe to it instead? Well, what's interesting, Logos, is really what's behind the Whig theory of history, and of course why Moldbug is a Whig, is technology, right? What is the progress that we're always talking about? Material conditions. What's driving the progress in material conditions?
Yeah, technology.
Yeah. So we all know that's what's driving Whig history. But Moldbug is being intentionally dishonest by ignoring that part because he is a part of the budding tech industry.
Well, not only that, but I mean, just taking tech out of it for a second, let's just go over the cycle of empire. So you have like a king who's like a warlord or something. He gets a bunch of his buddies together and they go raid a place. They take it over, right? It's our place now. All right, I'm going to rule it because I'm your leader. I'm your warlord, buddy. And to help me rule it, I'm going to appoint all of you to positions of power. That's going to work great until a bunch of these people die and start having kids. And these kids might know each other in the sense that they know of each other's families, but they might not be best bosom buddies like the original raiding party that took over the country, right? So they have some loose familial obligations. But eventually, the nobles are going to start looking for more power and ask, what's in all this for me? Well, now what's going to happen is the new king might want to start more wars, might be invaded, might have some favors, some things he needs to get done. Well, he's not best friends with the nobles like his great-great-great-granddaddy was. And so what he's going to do? He's going to say, okay, guys, I'm going to need your help with something. You're like the nobles. Like our house established you as the nobles. You owe us something. They're going to be like, well, we owed you something, but now we kind of have our own noble house thing going on here. What do you want from us, right? Well, then what's going to happen? Then the crown is going to have to give favors to the nobility, or they're going to have to try to seize it by force. And this basically describes a lot of British history. I was just reading recently about some revolution in Britain, 1688 or something, how the king tried to, force the nobility to give him a bunch of stuff for a war or something. And the nobles were like, no, screw you. And basically Parliament got a lot of power because the revolution was unsuccessful. That's basically how democracy transitions. You don't even have to appeal to technology. You can, and it's going to be a really helpful part of the analysis. But even if we just ignore that, just look at the cycle of empires, this has to happen because eventually the nobility and the emperors become less friendly. Emperors need stuff. Nobility gives stuff to help the emperors with strings attached. Those strings become basically increases in political power or favors or something. And as those strings get grown more, you get basically like a House of Lords political democracy. But then what happens when you have like the peasants? They're like, oh, hey, our lords are getting something from the status quo. We want it too. You eventually get a House of Commons.
Yeah. Another way to put this is before 1688, I just on Twitter said, history of England until 1688 TLDR. King gets into debt, calls Parliament. Parliament makes demands. King rejects demands. Coup, revolt, revolution, 3-2-1, ... King may or may not win, depending. I mean, that's the cycle until 1688, and then it stops.
Yeah.
You know, I think for most people, that's a pretty good deal.
I think so.
If you grew up in a democracy, as I assume everyone reading this did, there's a little goofball or neural tissue somewhere above your foramen magnum, which contains everything you know about politics and government. If you believe in the Virgin Mary, there is a similar golf ball, which contains all you know about the Immaculate Conception. If the Virgin has let you down and you are considering believing in ball instead, you should probably grow a whole new golf ball, which is dedicated to ball. Perhaps there's some way to construct a gradual transition from Mariolatry to ball worship, but I can't imagine why there should be. You know, for all his dunking on Catholic piety, he's got a lot of Catholic fans.
Yeah, you say that a lot.
Well, I mean, it bears repeating. I don't know why he has so many Catholic fans. They screech and re at the smallest. So good?
Oh, I was just agreeing. I just said, yeah.
Similarly, if there's any way to stop believing in democracy, the only way to do it is to A, grow a new golf ball that believers in whatever you'd believe in. If you didn't believe in democracy, B, compare the old and new golf balls and decide which you're more comfortable with. And C, allow the loser to reabsorb by the rest of your brain, which hopefully is young and flexible enough for this kind of appalling hot swap auto neurosurgery. A good example is the political dimension of left and right, which we're all familiar with. As perhaps you know, this is originally derived from the seating patterns in the 1791 Constituent Assembly. A certain Jonah Goldberg has just released a new book in which he argues that fascism, which most of us probably think of as right-wing, is in fact better understood as a form of leftism. I haven't read Liberal Fascism, but from the reviews I get the impression that it recapitulates much of the thought of Eric von Keelan-Ledeen. Goldberg may or may not be worth your time, but KL certainly is. But is he right? Is fascism right-wing or left-wing, and which would make it worse? It is better to be left or right or somewhere in the middle. What about the libertarian Nolan chart, which asserts that existence of a second dimension and blithely assumes the first? If to be left-wing is to support a personal freedom, what about, say, smoking, or being rude to someone with the wrong skin color, or driving too fast? It is all a bit of a muddle, demonstrating again why introducing ball into our Virgin Mary golf ball is a waste of time. To question democracy is to admit the possibility that the entire system by which you think about politics and government, past and present, is nonsense, or at least has no constituent relationship to reality. Perhaps we can understand what left and right mean from an endemotist perspective, but we need the perspective first. So if you knew something about government, how would you start to understand it? The obvious first question is government of what? Who is this government for? Can one system of government really fit all possible populations? What about aliens, dolphins, chimps, and orangutans? What? You have to be able to draw lines somewhere. I don't find the problem of governing aliens or dolphins interesting or useful at all. All I am interested in is the two-legged things that are walking around on planet 3 at present. There is a common English word for this animal, but I refuse to say it. The word has been attached to many ethical and historical concepts, all of which it imports instantly without going through any kind of mental security screening. I mean, Logos, I think almost anything Moldbug says didn't go through any kind of mental security screening, just for the record.
Noted.
A good way to pick up something that could be hard to get rid of if you get my drift. The Latin root cannot be avoided, though, so let's call them hominids. A hominid is any ape-like critter that was wandering around on its hind legs any time in the last 100,000 years. No gibbons need apply. Perhaps this is not quite exactly how paleontologists use the word at present, but it is well known, and I will stick with it. If we design systems of government for arbitrary populations of hominids by this definition, quite genetically broad. Considering the speed of recent evolution in the species, we are erring on the safe side. From an engineering perspective, it can't hurt if our theories also work for groups of hominids who are now extinct and who do not resemble hominids now living. Shifting the bar backward dodges the nasty problems of evaluating the actual populations now living, which a lot of writers seem to get quite hung up on. If we need to make the distinction, we can talk about the proto-hominids of 100,000 years ago and the neo-hominids of 2008. As long as you have some neo-hominids to actually staff your operation, I'd like to think it is perfectly possible to govern either both or any mix of the two. In any case, history starts with prehistory, and prehistory starts with biology. We know three things about hominids. They are social, territorial, and violent. Isn't that really interesting, Logos, that, like, the thing that Aristotle thought made humans distinct from animals, Moldbug leaves out reason?
Yeah.
Huh. I don't know. I mean, isn't that where most people would start if we're going to talk about what makes a human a human?
You'd think. That is kind of odd.
I mean, to even have a scientific process that Moldbug appeals to, some group of neo-hominids, to use this terminology, have to reason there. An excellent introduction to hominids in their cladistic context is the primatologist Richard Wrangham's Demonic Males. An excellent survey of prehistoric territorial behavior among hominids is anthropologist Lawrence Keeley's War Before Civilization. Hopefully these readings will be sufficient to rid you of any lingering Rousseauian golf ball that might be clogging up your foramen magnum. Briefly, hominids exhibit what might be called a default pattern of government. In the default pattern, the basic unit of government is the tribe, which controls a well-defined territory and defends it from other tribes. The tribe is a chief, generally male, whose decisions are final. He maintains power by using it to reward his friends, relations, henchmen, lackeys, etc. Hominids are very flexible and intelligent animals. They can exist in a wide variety of cultural configurations with all kinds of weird power dynamics. The default pattern, which we can see even in chimpanzees, is not inevitable, but it gives us a concise definition of government. A government is either A, the default pattern, or B, whatever organizational military suppresses the default pattern. You're right, but what is the default pattern, Logos?
We said the default pattern was tribalism.
Tribalism. Oh, I see. Default, yeah.
Yeah.
Can hominids exist without government in this sense? No, because hominids are social and violent. You might be able to breed a two-legged animal that was asocial and non-violent, but why call it a hominid? A more interesting question is whether a system of non-territorial projection agencies as proposed by anarcho-capitalists like Murray Rothbard and David Friedman can exist. The correct question is, could such a system stably suppress the default pattern? In the absence of a superior force which constrains its actions, the only distinction between a protection agency and the government appears to be that the former exhibit territorial overlap. Especially given hominid territorial instincts, can any such system be militarily stable? I doubt it, but I'm not a military expert. Of course, neither are most anarcho-capitalists.
Okay, that was kind of a good burn.
Actually, Logos, I've made that case before when I debated Bob Murphy.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of.
Okay, I mean, when Moldbug's right, Moldbug's right.
Moldbug's right, yeah.
I mean, that's exactly what I said. Well, in so many words. Occam's razor suggests to me that schools of political thought which purport to be anarchistic, a category which includes both anarcho-capitalism and Marxist-Leninism, both Marx and Lenin consistently insisted that they were not replacing the hated state, but building a new kind of social system which would express the will of the people directly, exist and even flourish, not because they have a realistic strategy for eliminating government without returning to the default pattern, but because they capitalize on the natural anti-governmental frustrations of hominids who find themselves with neither political power nor any prospect of attaining it. I am all for the polycentric world. I would personally be very happy to see a planet with thousands, even tens of thousands of independent polities. However, sovereign actors have enough trouble relating to each other, even with non-overlapping jurisdictions. If the advantage of overlapping is, as it appears, that it lets you call your government's protection agencies, I have to question the sincerity of the proposal. Libertarians and even anti-democratic libertarians like Hans Hermann Hoppe owe more to Locke than I think they realize. Locke was a Whig and a Puritan and a great tabula rasa man. The god of battles has treated his faction kindly. I don't believe this is a coincidence, but I don't think it makes Locke right. I'm sure he was a very nice guy, but Locke knew no more of hominid behavior than a cat knows of tennis. And I think any remaining Lockeans could stand a good dose of his Tory debunker, the sadly underappreciated Josiah Tucker. For the benefit of the 21st century readers, here is a tasty bit of Tucker in modern orthography. The OLL edition also contains many OCR errors. If you can stand the long S, try the original. Here, Tucker is comparing the divine right of kings to the divine right of the people. Once more, all laws made or to be made by the authority of usurpers, alias of kings de facto, are, according to the doctrine of Sir Robert Filmer and the Jacobites, absolutely null and void till they shall have received the sanction and confirmation of the rightful king. And so say the Lockeans in respect to their sole rightful king, the people. For here again they have told us so often that we cannot forget it, that no law can be valid unless the people have authorized the making of it. Nay, they have gone so far as to declare that the very essence of slavery doth consist in being governed by laws to which the governed have not previously consented. This being the case, you see plainly that the consideration whether the law be good or bad in itself, whether it is a law that is wanted or not wanted, and whether it tends to promote the liberty of the subject or to restrain it, is at present entirely beside the question. For the sole point here to be determined is simply this: had the makers of such a law any right to make it, according to the Lockean ideas of right and wrong? If they had no such right, they must be pronounced to be usurpers by the law in itself, whatever it may, and therefore, as they are usurpers, their doom is fixed, inasmuch as they cannot expect mercy for their daring attempts to alienate the unalienable rights of mankind. Before this Lockean system had been broached, or at least before it had made many proselytes among us, it used to be considered as no bad maxim in politics not to be very inquisitive concerning the original title of the reigning powers. For if the state was actually at peace, and if every man sat or might sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, or in plainer English, if the essential ends of government were answered both by the protection of good subjects and the punishment of bad ones, and also by the defense of the community from external violence, then it was thought that this was sufficient reason for considering such powers as ordained of God, and if ordered of God, the people ought to obey them under peril of damnation. But now it seems the world has grown much wiser, for the first question to be asked is, what is your title to be governor or chief magistrate of this country? And what proofs do you bring that you received your authority from the people without fraud on the one hand or violence on the other? Answer me this before you can expect that I should submit to obey you. Few governors, I believe, would like to be catechized after this manner by their subjects, and fewer still would be able to answer these questions to the satisfaction of a Lockean patriot. Nay, we have been expressly told by one among the chief among them, Dr. Priestley, that there is not a government on the face of the globe which can stand the tests of such an inquiry. For, says he, all governments, whatever have been in some measure compulsory, tyrannical, and oppressive in their origin. Now, this being the case, why will not these benevolent political philosophers erect a government of their own for the good of mankind? A government on their own plan and perfectly agreeable to Lockean principles, which shall therefore be a pattern for the rest of the world to copy after. Nay, why are they always sowing discord and dissensions among us instead of establishing a free and equal and harmonious republic among themselves? Most certainly Great Britain is not the proper spot for exhibiting specimens of this sort, because, to say the truth, we have had and we have felt too many of these political experiments already during the last century to wish to revive them again. But America, yes, the interior parts of America is the country of all others, the fittest for putting every fond imagination of their hearts in practice. For if fame says true, and if Mr. Locke himself is to be credited, there is as yet no government at all in the inland parts of these immense regions. Nor have even the Congress extended their gentle sway beyond the lakes Erie and Ontario, if they have gone so far. Thither, therefore, let all our Republican patriots speedily repair. Time is precious, and the cause invites. A passport will undoubtedly be granted to them as soon as applied for, and ample leave will be obtained to exchange the slavery of this country for the freedom of America. Thither, therefore, let them all retire, for there they will live according to the prediction of Dr. Price, undisturbed by bishops, nobles, or kings, and there likewise they will enjoy all the blessings which can attend that happy state, where every member of society will be his own lawgiver, his own governor, judge, and director. As Stanley Dan put it, all I can say is ouch. I'm afraid we have indeed in too many of these political experiments, You know what I want. The sinister futuristic totalitarian fantasy at the heart of Menchie's Moldbug thought. I want to live in a world where when I go to Google News and search for poisoned arrows, I get no hits at all. I mean, call me crazy. In any case, we have observed a problem with the word government. People have strange associations with it. As we've seen, it is not hard to define, but perhaps it is worth replacing. I will stick with the word sovereign, which is old, but whose definition is beautifully precise, and the extremely bland term organization, which just means a group of hominids working together in some coherent way. In the past, I tried corporation, which means exactly the same thing, but has undesirable pejorative connotations. Thus, instead of government, we can say sovereign organization or Sovorg. Since Sovorgs are territorial by definition, we can name them by location. We've already been through this. Like, this is what, the third or fourth time he's gone through this before, Logos?
Yeah, basically.
How do you get to go through this so many times and people think you're brilliant? You're just changing that last word. It's org, it's sov, it's, corp, it's whatever.
Mm-hmm.
This, for example, there is a very important sov org on the Potomac. We call it Wash org. Furthermore, while heeding Dean Tucker's wise warning against inquiring too closely into the original title, we can distinguish 4 discrete revisions of Wash org, separated by breaches of legal continuity. 1789, Confederation to Constitution, 1861, State to National Sovereignty, and 1933, Limited to Unlimited Government. So our presently lovely confection is Wash org 4. Is Wash org 4 good or bad? The question is an absurdly under-constrained. Good or bad to whom and for whom? Well, Logos, I thought good or bad were moral terms, and we don't deal with that.
That's a good question.
I mean, I don't know what Moldbug is even asking here. This is just a question without an answer. I mean,
it is. Is Moldbug trying to create friction, which creates political violence here? I mean, what's the deal?
I know. Like, I know. Secret Agent Moldbug sowing violence wherever he goes. What makes Sovorg good or bad? What makes anything good or bad? These are normative questions, presuming for Kim Jong-il and his family, North Korea is not bad at all. Though clearly to anyone on either side of the Atlantic in the 1770s, Wash org 4 would seem an appalling monstrosity. The dean himself is quite incisive on this point. Here, therefore, be it observed that without taking any advantage from the arguments that may be deduced from the tarring and feathering of numerous mobs, and without insisting on the burning and plundering of the houses and destroying the property of the loyalists by the American Republicans, even before they had openly thrown off their mask and set up for independence, I say, without bringing these instances as proofs that they would not grant that liberty to others for which they so strenuously contended for themselves, let us come to that very period when they had established various civil governments in their respective provinces and had new modeled their several constitutions according to their own good liking. I ask, therefore, was any one of these civil governments at first formed, or is it now administered and conducted according to the Lockean plan? And did or doth any of these congresses, general or provincial, admit of that fundamental maxim of Mr. Locke, that every man has an inalienable right to obey no other laws but those of his own making? No, so far from it, that there are dreadful fines and confiscations, imprisonments, and even death made use of as the only effectual means for obtaining that unanimity of sentiment so much boasted of by these newfangled Republicans and so little practiced. In one word, let the impartial world be the judge whether the Americans in all their contests for liberty have ever once made use of Mr. Locke's system for any other purpose but that of pulling down and destroying, and whether when they had come to erect a new edifice of their own on the ruins of the former, they have not abandoned Monsieur Locke, Polyneau, Priestley, and Price, with all their visionary schemes of universal freedom and liberty of choice. I particularly admire the dean's deft hand with the semicolon and dash, a move he shares with Frank Bidart. If you find this paragraph hard to parse, his argument is that any difference between the new American and the old British regime is essentially cosmetic, a point now admitted by all. In any case, the question remains good or bad. I will take the liberty of assuming that readers share my general taste in government. I suspect the taste in this matter is much like taste in restaurants. People can argue KFC versus Popeyes or Mickey D's versus BK, but no one puts any of them in a class with Nobu or the French Laundry. If you can't agree that Vaduz is well governed and Pyongyang is not, you are just quarreling. A simple way to ask the question is, if all things were equal, where would I rather live? If SF was owned and operated by Hans Adam II and Berkeley was owned and operated by the Kims, but I prefer to take my home in the East Bay or the West. We can distinguish two factors. Well, I don't know. Will he answer that question, Logos? Would he live on the East Bay or the West?
It's a good question.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. We can distinguish two factors in this decision: customer service and personal authority. Customer service expresses the way the Sov org treats me, its customer or resident. Personal authority expresses any power I may have over the operation of the Sov org. Suppose it is not Kim, but myself who runs Berkeley. That's a nice little shift, Logos. Now he doesn't have to answer the question.
Right?
Oh, well, I don't have to answer the question, guys, because I'm now the Kim. So there you go. If I was the ruler of Berkeley, it would undoubtedly serve me quite well. I'm not just the ruler, I'm also a customer. Would I settle for the ordinary plain Jane service? Heck no. I would have a limo, uniformed flunkies, but it would still be customer service, just extraordinary customer service. This, however, would not express all the satisfaction I receive from ruling Berkeley. After all, I too am a hominid, and hominids like power. While I am not as far as I am aware descended from Genghis Khan, I'm sure that possession of political power has often lubricated my Y chromosome's path to survival. This sort of thing leaves an impact. I suppose I was not sole ruler of Berkeley, but just one member of the triumvirate. The service would probably still be excellent, the limo might not be a swank, and my will could be frustrated by any two of my triumvirs. Definitely a step down. On the other hand, to make anything in Berkeley happen, all I have to do is persuade two people. How hard can that be? Suppose instead I was a member of a Grand Council of 100 whose bylaws strictly barred any special treatment. Berkeley would treat me and my fellow Grand Councilors just as I treated any other resident. But as long as I could browbeat 50 of my peers into submission, my will could still hold sway. What we see here is that personal authority, an intangible good but still very desirable one, can be disconnected from customer service. We see also that since personal authority is directly desirable, it need not follow any mathematical principles, linear or otherwise. Is being sole ruler of Berkeley 3 times as cool as being a triumvir? Maybe, but maybe not. Is being a triumvir 33 times as cool as being a ground councilor? Probably not. Of course, if Berkeley is a democracy with universal suffrage, Berkeleyite, who is full grown and capable of breathing, is effectively a minor dignitary. There's no limo and no flunkies, but there's still a small but intangible sense of somehow controlling events. Voting in a democracy makes you feel powerful, much as playing the lottery makes you feel rich. Perhaps it shouldn't, but why not? Perhaps you will win the lottery and your vote will matter. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Negligible power certainly does not corrupt absolutely, but I'm not sure it corrupts negligibly either. By handling a tiny piece of power to each of its residents, democracy performs the most essential task of a political structure, rewarding its supporters. If you can convince yourself to say the transaction is sordid and onanistic, you have taken a big step toward adomotism. Until voters learn to renounce this little wafer of fictitious authority that is regularly dropped on their tongue, they will never free themselves from democracy. Once we factor out personal authority, we are left with customer service, as the contrast between Vaduz and Pyongyang demonstrates. Sovereign customer service can include almost anything in life. A nasty Savor can enslave you, murder you, force you to wear nothing but shapeless, stretchy gray overalls, etc., etc. By definition, you have no recourse. What does good sovereign customer service mean to me? High security, low taxes, attractive landscaping, and an absence of pointless restrictions on my personal actions. Again, defining good government is not unlike defining good food. Reasonable people will tend to agree. You know, Logos, just a bookmark here, we're not defining what democracy as a historical phenomena is yet, are we?
Not yet, no. We were about to. Now we've taken this detour. I don't know what the hell's going on. He's ruling Berkeley, apparently.
Well, I don't know. Maybe. What do you want to bet at the end is going to be, oh, and by the way, folks, we didn't actually talk about democracy and history. Tune in next week.
That'd be pretty funny, right? Yeah, I don't know what him ruling Berkeley has to do with democracy yet.
Well, next week. For all my fan club that wants to see how I rule Berkeley, tune in next week. It is a very striking fact, therefore, that sovereign customer service in the world today, and specifically the customer service provided by Wash.org 4, seems to be so poor. Imagine if Hans Adam II were in charge not of Berkeley but of California. Don't you think you could make it such a desirable place to live that it would be the rest of North America, it's not like California doesn't have room for 300 million people. Of course, it's not clear that Hans Adam would want them at all. I certainly wouldn't. Before we look at how Wash.org got to its present perilous state, there is a very important aspect of sovereign customer service that is easy to miss. It provides a clue to the rest. The question is how the Sov.org controls its residents. We know that for it to be Sov.org, it must do so. Otherwise, the default pattern will reemerge. Internal control is a strictly negative aspect of customer service, except for the fact that almost any sovereign form is preferable to the default pattern. Since I am not well suited to tribal gang warfare, it can do something but annoy, inconvenience me, and other residents. There are two basic classes of internal control. A sovereign can control its residents by managing their minds or managing their bodies. We can call the former mode psiarchy, the latter physiarchy. A psiarchy persuades its residents to refrain from organizing, seizing, and capturing it. A physiarchy physically restrains its residents from organizing, seizing, and capturing it. From a customer service perspective, which is more desirable, psiarchy or physiarchy? What's neat about the question is that if you are like me, you probably don't have a knee-jerk answer. Well, okay, hold on. I'll finish and then I'll make my point. We have made it off the map of our democratic conditioning. No one wants to be physically dominated by an irresistible authority, but no one wants to have their minds controlled either, and logic offers us no third choice. What I was going to say is the modern American system is both. Think about it, Logos. The way our societies develop technologically with suburbs and highways and cities, it's hard for people like you to get around.
Yeah.
Like the literal landscape of the country, Logos, as we've shaped it, the physiarchy part has sort of it's hemmed all of us in, but it's hemmed in you a little bit more.
Oh, yeah.
But it's also a psiarchy in that people, even dissidents, can't think of any ruling government in America outside of the constraints that it's given us. Right? Because all the dissidents are doing is just imagining, oh, well, what if we were the people that lost to America? Right? It's not something new, right? It's still constrained by the narrative they gave us.
I agree.
So in those two cases, I don't know, maybe Moldbug will say we're ruled by both, but I do think we are. Let's see. Perhaps it helps if we separate psiarchy techniques of internal control into two classes, which we call legarchy and phobocracy. Under legarchy, the sovereign exercises internal control as an extension of the judicial system, which keeps residents secure from each other. It simply adds a class of offenses which are crimes against the Sovcorps without any other direct victim. For example, you may not train your paramilitary militia in the Sierras. You may not keep a cache of automatic weapons in your basement. If you are in a crowd and the police order you to disperse, you must do so. Violating any of these restrictions cannot be described as tort against any person. They are pure infringements on your personal freedom. They may even be arbitrary and inexplicable. However, as long as they are at least predictable, their impact on reasonable customers is minimal. Every city in the world has a death penalty for stepping in front of a bus. Does it, Logos? Maybe he just means it'll run you over. Or
yeah,
it's just
that's what
the
he
government.
means.
What?
Yeah, that's what he means. That's all he means.
Okay. I'm like, I don't think you're going to get killed. Okay. How do we live with this draconian, irrational, and instantly enforced rule? By not violating it. Most of us never give this matter a second thought. Whereas most of us would howl to high heaven if Wash.org published a list of illegal organizations for which membership incurs criminal penalties. But it is no more irrational to punish a resident for joining an organization than for stepping in front of a bus. If you relish the collegial pleasures of community, find some community that isn't trying to overthrow the government. Otherwise, can you really complain? So wait, is Moldbug just going to tell us, Logos, we need to treat the government like a bus and just have it run people over?
I don't think he's going to go that far. We'll see.
Okay. We enter a different territory with phobocracy, which is the tactic of maintaining internal control by unpredictable intimidation. Death squads, for example, are a classic technique. Most of us consider finding bodies on the doorstep let alone being one of those bodies, remarkably unacceptable from a customer service perspective. However, since many 20th century cyborgs have maintained power by exactly this method, we would be foolish to dismiss it. Phobocracy, terrorism, essentially, in the original sense of the word, is best seen as a sort of force multiplier for weak or insecure cyborgs. Of course, it can also be used by organizations which do not hold power but are contending for it. If you are secure in power, you have no need to strike fear into your enemies by spectacular random attacks. You know who they are, you can have them arrested and imprisoned or deported according to taste. Moreover, if you are genuinely secure, political enemies should be able to recognize the fact just as well as anyone, and they will abandon their pointless struggle. Everyone who fights, fights to win. Well, okay, Logos. Now, I know this is 2008, but this paragraph here, Moldbug is tacitly admitting that the deep state today is insecure.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's lashing out at Donald Trump, right?
That's a good point.
And the January 6th protesters. So then, wait. If this state's insecure and unstable, if this is the behavior of an insecure and unstable state, then why is it telling the normies to not go further? Because by going further, you could then topple this weak and insecure state.
Well, because they're just going to lash out at you, Todd.
Oh. Okay, there you go. And you don't want to be that body on the doorstep, right, Logos?
Of course not. Of course not. They'll sweep you under the rug.
Just let me keep seducing them, right, Logos?
That's right. You just pick the safe option. Let them dark elves seduce the elites for you. It'll happen any decade now.
Any decade now. Psyarchy is a method of internal control by which a cyborg manages its residents' opinions, emotions, and perceptions. If residents love, cherish, and honor their cyborg, they are far less likely to become unruly. Of course, for this to work, they need to actually be under the impression that their thoughts are their own, or at least obtained from fundamentally trustworthy sources. This adds a touch of daring do to the affair. Drugging the water supply, inserting subliminal messages in fast food ads, and beaming slogans into your tooth fillings are uncommon, ineffective forms of psyarchy. They do use ads. I don't know what he's talking about. Mandatory loyalty training for children, official support for approved information, producers, and social, civil, or criminal penalties for a wrong think are common effective forms of psyarchy. The second is especially interesting. I think the special word massarchy is appropriate for the 20th century system of internal control via education, journalism, and science. Each of these words assumes a systematic professional infallibility, entirely unearned in the case of the first two professions and increasingly dubious in the case of the third. The Third Reich had its own wonderful word for distribution of official information, Aufklärung, meaning literally clearing up, and more broadly, enlightenment. Indeed, all the state-sponsored information professions see their task as that of enlightening the public, and from enlightening to guiding in a small step indeed. What's puzzling about psyarchy is that psyarchy basically sucks, yet we see it everywhere. Unraveling this mystery is crucial, I feel, to an understanding democracy. Sucks at what? I mean, it obviously controls people.
Yeah.
I don't. No, it's clearly more effective than the use of force, and that's what Aldous Huxley mentioned in his interview with Mike Wallace.
Mm-hmm.
Because people don't actually know who's controlling them, so they might be angry, they might be upset, but they don't know who to point the finger at.
Yeah.
Which is good for the people in charge. Psyarchy is the lousy customer service because it's creepy and weird. I want my solver to keep marauding gangs from assaulting my residents. I don't want it to care what I think. I certainly don't want it to take any kind of fatherly interest in what my children think. Raising kids is hard enough as it is. When they come home from school to start reciting government slogans, the temptation to lock them in the closet may become overwhelming. Because remember, Logos, remember, under the English monarchy, they totally didn't care what you thought.
Yeah, exactly.
They just let you make money, right? Just pay your taxes, be a good Englishman. They didn't care what you thought. I mean, even though at one point the kings of England would, when they were Catholic, would burn you at the stake for being a Protestant, and then when they had Anglicans, then they then they hunted down Catholics. Sure, no, but they didn't care what you thought, Logos. Don't remember that.
Yep.
But Psyarchy is also very unreliable as a mechanism of internal control. If you need to prevent your residents from organizing private paramilitary movements, tell them not to organize private paramilitary movements. Warn them if they do, and if they don't, desist, arrest them. Not only is this about 12 million times easier and less intrusive than brainwashing generations of children to swear obedience to the state, it's also a heck of a lot more effective. Children are notoriously fickle. If you tell them to think X, sometimes they decide to think Y instead just for the pleasure of misbehaving. Worse, if Psyarchy relies on propagating a perception of reality that a sensible, independent person would not share, it is unstable in the nastiest way. The so-called marketplace of ideas is a strange market indeed, where your friendly local Sawborg has a thumb on every scale, but if the thumb ever starts to slip, look out. The truth has strange advantages of its own. A Sawborg whose continued rule depends on successful Psyarchy is like a city below sea level. It can engineer the world's best seawalls, dikes, and levees, but only one of them has to fail. So we conclude, from both sides of the game, the Sawborg and its customer oligarchy is the most desirable system of internal control, except in the nastiest, most unusual situations amounting more or less to civil war. It is the only approach any Sawborg should need, and yet history shows us that almost all 20th century Sawborgs relied heavily on Psyarchy, Phobarchy, and of course both. What gives? What gives is that comparing 20th century Sawborgs is like comparing German restaurants. No doubt some are better than others, but unless you like sausage, cabbage, and root vegetables, you're basically out of luck. Even Washorg 4, certainly among the best of the lot, would have appalled not only Josiah Tucker, but also the American rebels he so despised, most of whom can be found delivering quotes on subject of democracy that make Hitler sound like Barack Obama. Note that most of these sound bites, Federalist 10 being a good example, date to the 1780s, which means that they were products of experience, not ideology. Even Burke started out as a Whig. What made him change his mind? Not Dean Tucker, that's for sure. It's striking how few people read Federalist 10 in light of the actual historical experience. Surely it is plain to everyone that the problems Madison describes are real, and the solutions he proposes are quackery par excellence, for example. The other point of difference is the greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican than of Democratic government, and it is this circumstance principally which renders factious combinations less to be dreaded in the former than the latter. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party, and the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed. The more easily will they concert and execute their plans of oppression, extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Besides other impediments, it may be remarked that where there is a consciousness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose concurrences is necessary. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular state, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states, as religious sects may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against dangers from that source. A rage for paper money, or for abolition of debts, or for an equal division of property, or for any improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it, in the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than the entire state. This reminds me of nothing so much as that bit in Isaac Asimov's Foundation where the mule appears and Hari Seldon starts spewing utter nonsense. Reading a document like Federalist 10 is like reading an explanation by the chief engineer of the space shuttle of how when the shuttle is built, it will be cheaper to take a vacation in space than in Australia. The fact that the thing was built and is still operating is interesting, but a brief perusal of the design documents tell us that it's not operating anything like the way envisioned by its designers. You see, this is the other thing that's just really annoying and stupid about Moldbug. One, even now, though the country is riven by divisions, Madison is right. Not a single one of these political ideologies dominates the whole country.
Yep.
I mean, where is he wrong? He's right. I mean, there are people that want gold money, people that don't want gold money. There's people that want to redistribute the property. There's people that don't. But because this country is so big, no one of them has a single dominating voice.
Yep.
The other thing is when Moldbug says this is not the government we have as of 2008 is not the government envisioned by the founding fathers. Yeah, no shit. But here's the difference. That inexplicable rise of FDR was the result of the state combating corporate power. And the power that the state acquired was the result of technology. And since Moldbug is a defense of both, the forces he represents are why this isn't the country Madison wrote about.
Mm-hmm.
It's just entirely disingenuous, really. If the exercise of thinking through the problems of government from scratch has convinced me of anything, it has convinced me that effective government and good government are one and the same thing. Oh, there you go. But no, but Logos, good government isn't a thing at all because good isn't political.
Yeah.
As long as Sovlorg is effectively and coherently managed, and its proprietors are motivated by ordinary hominid motivations such as money and power, preferably the former, it will deliver what it thinks of as good government, and it will not engage in nasty and dangerous practices such as phobarchy and sciarchy. Oh, well, that's... yeah, because remember, Logos, the East India Company didn't do any of that.
Yeah, I mean, we want more people to live here. So how are you going to get more people to live here? You're going to have to advertise. Advertising is obviously a form of sciarchy, just by definition. You have the problem where citizens are going to want more power for themselves. They're always going to not like their lot in life. There's always some that are going to try to gain more power. You have to stop them from doing it, either by making it hard for them to organize a counter-revolutionary gang or, whatever. I don't care what your form of government is. You're going to have some of this. Otherwise, it's just violence all the way down.
Yeah, this is... I know we're not done reading, but this is pretty good from Charlemagne. Taking a detour, never actually demonstrating anything about the main point. Imagine that.
Yep.
Imagine that, Logos. So I conclude that 20th century Sovlorgs have not delivered good customer service. It is simply because they are not and have not been well managed. Think of them as the equivalent of Pemex, perhaps, if Pemex was a tax farm rather than an oil monopoly. Why hasn't Pemex gone out of business? Because it can't. To see democracy as a historical phenomenon, to understand how the disaster could have happened, we have to interpret it as an internal element of sovereign organization, not internal in the sense of pertaining to residents rather than to foreigners, but in the sense of internal memo. No one has helped create Washorg. No one who helped create Washorg could have imagined the present state of Washorg for it, let alone hoped for it. Yet it is what it is now, and most of its residents cherish and revere it. How did this happen? It just did. The thing can't really go out of business after all. Oh, so Logos, governments can't fall. That's interesting.
Yeah.
You learn something new every day. The Roman Empire must still be around somewhere, right, Logos?
It never went out of business, Todd. It just changed ownership.
Oh, right. That's good. That's good. So when we look at the sciarchy as a conscious strategy, it strikes us as silly. Suppose, for example, the elders of Zion secretly control the government, which secretly controls the media, which brainwashes Americans into not suspecting that they are actually subjects of the Zionist occupation government, the infamous Zog. It should reassure us to realize that this makes no sense at all, as indeed it does not. Why should the Zionists bother with secrecy and manipulation if they really control the government? Isn't the Duke of Wellington's motto perfectly sufficient? Presumably, if the Iron Duke lived another half century, he would have modified it, which doesn't rhyme as well, but makes even better military sense. That just shows that Moldbug is being stupid. If you have control, that is precisely why you would use secrecy and manipulation, because otherwise people would know who to point the finger at.
Yeah.
How is this not obvious? Like if you're ordering the stormtroopers to march out of your palace to arrest and torture the peasants, guess who everybody knows to blame?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, you. I feel this is a pity because I, for one, would be quite reassured to learn that the Elders of Zion were in control. I prefer Hans Adam too, but given Hans Adam's success in the financial industry, I suspect he and the Elders would work quite well as a team. Actually, the truth is much uglier than this. The only way I could imagine it being worse is if it involved Cthulhu, which it doesn't, at least not as far as I can tell. The truth is that no one is in control. Wow.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Wow. Okay. We're getting somewhere, Logos. What have I been saying? In Wash, Oregon, its global friends and relations, we're looking at a gigantic, spontaneously evolving, uncontrolled system.
Spontaneously evolving. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Convenient, huh? The decision-making process, as we call democracy, is best seen as a part of the system, as are the voters whose opinions guide Wash.org 4's decisions. Since Wash.org 4 is a massarchy, since it guides public opinion as well as being guided by it, it can only be seen as a dynamic feedback loop. Anthony Blair, in his last speech before retiring, presented what I think is his own analysis of the situation. While I don't agree with it in all respects, while it certainly understates the magnitude of the problem, I think Blair's media speech may well prove to be the last frank and honest public statement by any Democratic politician ever. For all I know, he even wrote it himself. This might be overstating things, but it's certainly well worth the read. If our feedback loop is converging on any attractor, our only way to predict it is to study the dynamics of the loop itself. The assertion that any stage in this loop, mass opinion, the official information organs, or Wash.org 4 proper has any tendency to converge on sanity and good sense is unsustained at best. It could even be described as laughable. The system could be fluctuating randomly and unpredictably, or it could be headed by some stable point that almost everyone in 2008 could consider horrifying and unbearable. This is why I'm so keen on finding a way to terminate Wash.org 4. It is extremely dangerous and completely out of control. What else do you need to know? Well, that's interesting, because apparently in a mere 15 years, he's trying to defend it.
Yeah. He's trying to make it more efficient.
It's in Sun Tzu, right? If you're fighting your opponent, just make it more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
What's particularly nasty about the feedback loop of democratic massarchy is that when we ask why Wash.org 4 does what Wash.org 4 does, when we look to understand or at least predict it, our only answer is that its future actions are purely predicted by whatever perspectives are most strongly selected in the loop. Unfortunately, this includes a class of perspectives like the one I described last week. No one, or at least hardly anyone, who brought up as a ruling class the Brahmin-Dalit alliance and the strength of Yi, though of thought or thinks of these policies as ruthless or Machiavellian, au contraire, in their logic and their stated objectives, they are almost saintly. Wait, Logos, wait. If nobody's actually in control of Wash.org, where did I read that? Yeah, it's an uncontrolled system because it's gigantic and spontaneously evolving. Right. What's even the point of capturing it? You can't.
Well, that, and if it's spontaneously evolving and nobody's controlled, how do what the masses want guide WashCore, and how does WashCore guide the masses? It's under the control by nobody, so there's no controlled system to guide the masses. Sure. And if it's spontaneously evolving, why would what the masses care about dictate anything it does if its actions are spontaneous? He can't have that both ways.
Trying to have things both ways seems to be Moldbug's MO, just saying. Because these policies are conceived as saintly, they are very successful in the stage of the feedback loop that involves replacing perspectives. Everyone wants to be saintly. However, because these policies have a ruthless and Machiavellian effect, they are very successful in the sovereign stage of the loop. At each step, they defeat the competition. If there is any effect that will stop this loop from reinforcing itself monotonically over time, and is not obvious to me. 2020, anybody? It is very possible that the sooner it can be terminated, the easier the job will be. Well, okay, Logos, I got it. 2020, Dark Elves in control, trust the plan. That's why they shut down the whole world.
Exactly.
Right. Dark elves in control.
Nobody's in control, Todd.
That's true.
Nobody's in control. The world spontaneously evolved into a shutdown for no reason.
Oh yeah, that's good. That's good. I know I'm turning into a hopeless Charles Francis Adams groupie, but let's take one last look at this essay, and that essay I mentioned the other week. What's so neat about an underdeveloped function is that Adams not only explains the past, but provides a horrifying glimpse of the future. Of course, he thinks he's helping, but he's dead wrong. Take a look at his conclusion. As I have also more than once already observed, this association is largely made up of those occupying the chairs of instruction in our seminaries of the higher education. From their lecture rooms, the discussion of current political issues is of necessity excluded. There it is, manifestly out of place. Others here are scholars for whom no place exists on the political platform. Still others are historical investigators and writers interested only incidentally in political discussion. Finally, some are merely public-spirited citizens on whom the oratory of their stump palls. They crave discussions of another order. They are the men whose faces are seen only at those gatherings, which someone eminent for thought or in character is invited to address. To all such, the suggestion I now make cannot be but grateful. It is that in future this association as such shall so arrange its meetings that one at least shall be held in the month of July, preceding each presidential election. The issues of that election will then have been presented and the opposing candidates named. It should be understood that the meeting is held for the purpose of discussing those issues from a historical point of view and in their historical connection. Absolute freedom of debate should be insisted on, and the participation of those best qualified to deal with the particular class of problems under discussion should be solicited. Such authority, speaking from so lofty a rostrum to a select audience of appreciative men and women, could, I confidently submit, hardly fail to elevate the standard of discussion, bringing the calm lessons of history to bear on the angry wrangles and distorted presentations of these whole chief, if not only aim is a mere party supremacy. The basic point of this essay is that politics in the 19th century went mad and took public opinion with it, or possibly the other way around, or both. In any case, in the world of 1901, political hysteria is rampant and unchecked, and the sanity of the 1860s is a distant memory. And what is the solution? It is the worst idea I could possibly think of. It makes little Jimmy Madison's genius prophecy that the United States will be too large to have political parties look like Hari Seldon on his best day. Adams proposes to introduce historians into politics. That is, he believes that persons such as himself, possessed of tremendous taste, experience, and judgment, can raise the level of public opinion by bringing historical perspectives to factional political debates, a very common sort of thought for an aristocrat of Adams, liberal, Republican, or mugwump ilk. Well, as far as I know, this specific proposal was never implemented. It's certainly the case that over the next 20 years, the American intellectual class began its great project of capturing public opinion at the expense of barbaric political chiefs, old schools, press lords, capitalist robber barons, and others now routinely depicted as demonic. The project was essentially complete by 1933, when the dilettante figurehead FDR took power at the head of the Academic Brain Trust, installed courtesy of Southern racists, urban Irish, and Italian machines, and the other corrupt vote banks that comprised the Democratic Party, all of whom would get, as Mencken so nicely phrased, the government they deserved. The only problem with this triumph is expressed by a little saying I once heard, which is that if you pick a drop of wine in a barrel of sewage, you get a barrel of sewage. Oh, if you put a drop of wine. If you put a drop of sewage in a barrel of wine, you get a barrel of sewage. The saying did not go on to remark that if you put a dam at one end of Napa Valley and a sewer line at the other, you'll get a whole wine industry devoted to bottling sewage and selling it as cabaret, but we can infer it. Adams, who really ought to have known better, thought it would be possible to improve the American political system by connecting it to the American intellectual system. Perhaps he thought he had some kind of one-way valve, that select audience of appreciative men and women, perhaps, that he could insist between the two. The result was inevitable, abominable, and yet grimly hilarious, similar to acting and certainly laughing. I mean, again, one, we didn't get democracy as a historical phenomena.
Nope.
As we would have expected. Two, we didn't actually bring historians into politics. I mean, don't you remember Logos? Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly, these progressives, whatever we want to call them, didn't do that. And notice he
Well,
doesn't say why it wouldn't have worked.
what he did, his argument basically is when you try to bring history into politics, what you end up doing is bringing politics into history. So this "hey hey ho ho Western Civ got to go" mantra is a result of a psyop on the populace, causing them to evaluate history with current progressive prejudices, basically stripping away all its lessons. So, in trying to merge the two to make history give you better decisions of democracy, what you've done is you've democratized history so it can remove all the icky parts.
Right, but the guy he was quoting was writing in 1901.
Yeah.
So that's not what was going on back then.
No. Not what's going on back then, but it's what Moldbug would predict would happen later. And he's kind of right, actually. I mean, he wrote this in 2008. We weren't toppling statues of the fathers back then. We're doing it now.
Well, we're doing it now. Okay. Return to Castle Goldenstein, the gold market in a nutshell. Oh, Logos, you ready for this?
No.
You ready? February 28th, 2008. I mean, maybe you should read this, Logos. This is like your thing, the gold market.
All right, here goes. With the Fed sounding like they share an office with the Hillary campaign. Oh, wow. I can't believe that's 2008. Any minute now, I fear, Dr. Bernanke is going to crack and accuse Greg Ip of fluffing the euro's pillow and the metals markets bubbling over like a bad quesadilla. Perhaps it's time for me to share some of my eccentric thoughts on the old yellow fellow. Our goal today is to understand the gold market. From King Tut till now, we'll start with the abstract economics, whip through some financial history, and wind up in the weird world of ETFs, DGCs, the CBGA, COMEX, and the IMF. If these letters mean nothing to you, all the better. Most of what most people know about gold is, in my humble opinion, wrong. Of course, my opinions about gold are just that. I am neither an economist nor a financial professional. I am certainly not a registered investment advisor. Wall Street bets. Everything I know about precious metals, I taught myself. If any aspect of my presentation inspires any confidence or respect, I am probably doing something wrong. Okay, I like that intro. At the very least, please do not make financial decisions with reference to my eccentric economic theories, which are probably also fascist, sexist, and anti-Semitic, unless you are at least sure you understand them and can defend them in a fair argument with an intelligent and well-informed paperhead. I should also mention that my own derisory savings are all in cash, i.e., gold and silver bullion, not, in case anyone plans a raid on the castle Maldenstein, retained therein. Can you say Zurich, boys and girls? I knew you could. First, the fundamental fact about gold is that it is a natural currency. James Turk, whose satisfied customer I am, is by no means infallible, but this brief post of his makes as good as an introduction to any. This lovely freelance piece, the San Francisco Chronicle, by local comedy man Rob Baedeker, is the first sympathetic treatment of a gold bug I've ever seen in a newspaper. When gold is hip, governments wake up in a stone cold sweat. However, the starting point for my amateur aurology is a mysterious essay that appeared in 2006 on the notorious doom-mongering financial aggregator Safehaven. Its author, the blatantly pseudonymous John Law, has not reappeared and does not appear to be answering his email. I think it's pretty safe to assume he was run over by a bus. Probably a joke of the previous article. While I certainly don't agree with all of Mr. Law's opinions, and it should be noted that the financial crisis he predicts, a currency run, is not at all the same thing as the financial crisis which is happening now, a bank run. I think his basic theory of money is more or less right. If gold is money, there is no way to explain gold without explaining money, so let me give it a whack. Wow, that's a long intro. We still haven't even got to the meat of this thing yet. To make a long story short, Law's theory of money is that currency selection is a coordination game driven by appreciation effects rather than coincidence of wants. As we'll see, this is not quite the same as the Menger Mises Austrian theory of money, but it could be seen as a variant, neo-Austrian perhaps. The classical Austrians had many advantages. Game theory was not among them. But if you think of Mises' regression theorem as a sort of proto-game theory avant la lettre, you may be on the right page. Perhaps this is all gobbledygook to you. What is money? In our usual UR style, try and forget everything you know about this stuff. Imagine you are an incredibly advanced alien and your spaceship has developed some kind of awful navigation defect that misrouted you to Planet 3. While you're waiting for the natives to advance their crew technology far enough to at least patch your quantum warp belt, you have nothing better to do than to study their barbaric economic habits past and present. You notice an weird pattern of trade that seems to hold across a variety of civilized societies. I'll let Carl Menger describe it in his On the Origins of Money. I don't think we need to read all that. Attracted to the force I shall
You wanna skip Menger?
Yeah, we'll skip that. In other words, Menger, writing of course in the heyday of the classical gold standard, observes the following mystery: a strange good which appears to be of very little use at all, and yet is fervently desired by everyone. First, note the contrast with modern gold bug twaddle of gold's intrinsic value. While gold is certainly more useful than green slips of paper, the difference is minor in perspective. Pretty much anything you can get exchanged for a Krugerrand is much, much handier around the house than the Krugerrand. While it is not obvious that the same logic explains the anomalous valuation of Krugerrands and Benjamins, Occam's razor suggests that we should at least give it a shot. There's a second strange observation which Menger doesn't make, but I will. This is that in addition to being anomalously overvalued, the good in question is anomalously stockpiled. For example, there are about 150,000 tons of gold in the world today, most of which is being used for nothing at all. Obviously, the same observation holds for paper currencies. This is a very different pattern than we see for other commodities in the Wall Street sense of the term, say wheat or zinc or frozen concentrated orange juice. While there are warehouses full of all the above, the stock to production ratio of gold is orders of magnitude higher than for any other good, even other precious metals. Oh, I see where he's going with this. Since annual gold production is about 2,500 tons, the gold industry keeps 60 years of inventory on hand. Imagine this if this was the case for, say, iPods or even zinc. Its bizarre stock to flow ratio is the easiest way to see that, even in the futuristic techno world of 2008, gold remains a monetary commodity. Okay, I'll pause for a second. So where I think he's going to go with this is when he's talking about appreciation. Um, it's not just the coordination problem. So early in the article, he talked about the coordination problem. How person A has good A and wants good X, and person B has good X but wants good Y, and person C has good Y but wants good D. And you have all these people that have and want different things. That's a coordination problem. How do we get everybody what they want? Money is like the medium of exchange that helps people do it. But he's talking about appreciation. So what he's talking about here is gold isn't like wheat or oil or other commodities. Actually, it could be a lot like oil. So let's put that off the side for a second. It's not like wheat or zinc or other commodities where you'll keep some in reserve, but generally speaking, you want to sell quite a bit of what you produce to make money. What he's saying is people will stockpile almost as much gold as they produce, in the where you wouldn't do for these other commodities. And he's going to get to why that is. And I think where he's going with this is possibly there may not be more gold in the future. We might tap out of all the gold once we dig deep enough, or it just becomes too energy inefficient to mine it. Kind of like what you've been saying with oil. You won't be able to mine oil anymore or gold anymore, but people still want gold. And so people, suspect there's like an anti-inflationary pressure on gold in which you can't extend the supply forever. And so what he's saying is if you're hoarding stockpiles of gold when the gold supply taps out, but people still want a bunch of gold, yay you, because it's just going to skyrocket in value as supply can't keep increasing the demand. So they're going to have to come to you at very, very inflated prices. So this is what he's talking about when he's talking about like the appreciable nature of like a natural currency like gold. If you have it and keep it, it will naturally appreciate. You don't have to rely on banks, interest rates, uh, you know, anything like that to increase your wealth. It'll just do it naturally by you having it. Okay, so here we go. It is very difficult to distinguish monetary from industrial users of gold, largely because a large percentage of today's gold stockpile is held in South Asia as investment jewelry. The linked Daniel Gross essay, sourced from the egregious virtual metals, is a classic example of how analyzing a monetary good using ordinary commodity market tools produces gross systematic errors. Except for psychological reasons, it matters very little how much gold is extracted every year. The number could go up to 5,000 tons or down to zero. Either there is a small addition to the stockpile. There is no reason to assume these small annual deltas have any large direct effect on the gold to dollar exchange rate. gold is gold, new or old? Um, kind of, kind of. I mean, there is a reason because as people around the world industrialize, get more money, have more demands for stuff, plausibly, increase for demand for gold around the world can skyrocket. But if the supply for gold is constrained, if it does go down to zero, you enter a situation where supply can't meet demand, and so there's going to be huge demands on the stockpiles people have stored available, and that will put upward pressure on the prices because if people are going to be selling gold to people all over the world newly demanding it, but they don't know if they're going to get more, they'll probably part with it at a higher price. So I don't understand why he's making that argument here. Of course, it matters how much gold is incoming every year when you're looking at changes in global demand for gold. Okay, so putting our alien back on, we have a rough general picture of the strange phenomena, money. It is a good that is either not very useful or downright useless, but still is considered very desirable and is stockpiled in large quantities. Why would this be? Is it some quirk of hominid psychology, an irrational instinctive attraction which leads the violent hairy biped to crave shiny metals and pictures of dead presidents? Is this why every advanced society seems to have at least one such good? We can't certainly rule it out, however, a simpler answer presents itself. Suppose our hominids are engaging in the following pattern of trade, which we'll call monetary transaction pattern. At time t0, our hominid produces some original good or service, O, and exchanges it for some intermediate good, I. He holds I until t1, which he exchanges it for some final good or service, F, which he consumes. Between t0 and t1, the subject thus holds a stockpile of I, a good which he has no plan to use. Does this ring a bell? Perhaps the phenomenon we call money is the result of a whole society of hominids who, for whatever bizarre bipedal reason, have all chosen the same I. Yeah, he's describing the coordination problem here, basically. Money is a medium of exchange, so people who make vastly different goods or services can exchange with each other via a medium. Um, this explains the anomalous stockpile. Kind of. People want goods sooner rather than later, so if they could trade the money for the goods, why wouldn't they just do it? So no, that doesn't fully explain the stockpile. It does not explain the anomalous valuation. It tells us nothing about why hominids might engage in this odd behavior. Why, for example, doesn't our hominid just keep O until T1 and exchange it directly for F? Well, because he might not find somebody who wants F for a long time. He's hedging against future uncertainty, especially if he needs F to live, for example. If F is a type of foodstuff and O isn't, he might need to get his hands on F as soon as possible. And so if he can trade for I and then trade I for F quickly, he'll do it. Okay, here's a simple example of the MTP. I don't know what MTP means. Our subject Sven is a fisherman. His original good O is fish. Salmon, perhaps. His final good is a white Cadillac convertible with wire wheels. His plan is to net salmon for 20 or 30 years and buy the caddy. If Sven just keeps O until T1, he'll have a huge pile of rotten salmon in his backyard. Exactly. Time preference. Frankly, this is no way to retire. Hope is not a retirement strategy, especially when all your assets are in fish. At least it's liquid, sort of, but it won't get you any Cadillacs. So Sven exchanges O for a storable good I, such as palladium, and he is happy. In other words, the MTP exists because the Svens of the world want to exchange present goods for future goods. O at T0 for F at T1, fish now for Cadillacs later, and because not all O are storable, therefore Sven has to select some good which is easy to store, I,
So real
palladium.
quick, Logos, I think TP might represent time preference for the
Uh,
MTP acronym.
it could, yeah.
I don't know what M represents though.
Monetary time preference?
Maybe he didn't really define it.
Yeah, I didn't catch it. One way to understand the MTP is to create a strange world in which it does not exist. Imagine if we modify Nitropia so that anyone can trade with anyone anywhere by teleporting goods. In addition, we'll assume that all goods can be stored perfectly without any overhead. Is the result of a pre-monetary equilibrium in which no one has any reason to stockpile an item and has no plans to use. I believe it is, but it is also about as unrealistic as it gets. With all the monsters in the world, a Nitropia with these rules would be pretty boring. Okay, Nitropia I think is the MMO thing he was talking
Yes.
about a long time
Yeah.
ago. Yeah. The other problem too is it won't solve the stockpiling problem completely. even though you can trade goods instantly and you can store them without overhead, it might take you a long, long, long time to get them. Um, and so even if you could trade, say, 50,000 salmon for a Cadillac, it would take you quite a bit of time to get all that salmon to trade it for a Cadillac. Um, so I still think there might even be a use for money in this economy somewhere, just to account for like how much time it's going to take you to collect that much salmon. It's probably debt. Debt's going to come into this somewhere. I think that's where he's also talking about valuation. Okay. Menger's classical Austrian theory of the origin of money relies on the coincidence of wants. That's true. The same is also true for the latest neoclassical theory, that of Kiyotaki and Wright, which may interest you if you're behind the firewall and have some kind of pathological Aspergery assumption with mathematical pseudocode. Okay, I'm being attacked. You shut up, Moldbug.
I know. I was like, whoa.
Otherwise, stick with Menger, or his successor Mises, or later Rothbard. The classical Austrians may not have been right about everything, but at least they knew how to explain economics in English, or German anyway. In Menger's world, Sven selects palladium for a very simple reason. He has salmon and nothing else. At T0, he trades with someone who has palladium and wants salmon. At T1, he trades with someone who has a Cadillac and wants palladium. Why palladium? Why do we use TCP/IP rather than DECnet or AppleTalk? Because it's the standard. Translating between standards is a pain in the butt. When standards compete, one tends to win and the others go away. Yeah, that's true. Sayonara HDTV. HD DVD.
Real quick, logos. Maybe that's why the state replaced all of its competitors.
Yeah, I know, right? Crazy.
Oh, crazy.
I think Moldbug would agree with that too. Let's see. In Sven's world, money is palladium. Gold is an exotic industrial metal, sometimes used for plating speaker cables. There's no one who wants to trade gold for salmon or Cadillacs for gold. The basic problem with Manger's approach, from my perspective, is that he's concerned with the historical origin of money, whereas I'm concerned with its logical origin. What Manger wanted to know is how money actually appeared. What I want to know is how it can happen. So clearly, in the actual historical context in which money originated, the coincidence of wants was a serious problem, and Mangerian effects would no doubt appear. On the other hand, in Itropia, with its advanced teleportation technology, barter is a trivial problem. If Sven wants to use gold as his eye and he finds a salmon buyer who has nothing but palladium, no problem. He trades salmon for palladium and palladium for gold, and he is there. Wall Street is not Nitropia. Financial engineering is nifty, but it can't teleport bullion. But Wall Street looks a lot more like Nitropia than either looks like, say, ancient Greece. If we are concerned with the gold market today, and why shouldn't we be? What is economic? What is economics? Touch football? Nitropia is probably a better model. And it is a fact that even in Nitropia, as long as there are fish which don't keep and fishermen who want to retire, the MTP makes sense, which means any Nitropians who practice the MTP must select some intermediate good I, and since the coincidence of wants is not a problem, Manger's analysis cannot apply. Thus, we see that Manger did not find the origin of money. He found an origin of money. That is, he found one way of breaking the pre-monetary equilibrium, eliminating teleportation, which could trigger one process of monetary standardization. Manger's analysis does not and cannot show that the coincidence of wants effects is the only force that can result in standardized money. Perhaps there's another. Indeed, there is. This is where he's going to talk about appreciation, I think. Back to Sven. Suppose that Sven can select any intermediate good he wants. For any I, the transaction cost of exchanging salmon for I or I for a Cadillac is comparable. He is not bound in any way by the monetary preferences of salmon eaters or Cadillac makers. His choice is truly his own, or so it seems. So does he choose? The question is a little open-ended. Let's narrow it down. Suppose Sven is choosing between only two possible intermediate goods, LA, IA or IB. Say IA is palladium and IB is rhodium. What is Sven's algorithm? It is actually quite simple. All Sven cares about is the change in the exchange rate between palladium and rhodium across the time window T1 minus T0 of the transaction. If IA divided by IB at time 1 is greater than IB divided by IB at time 0, he prefers palladium. If it's smaller, he prefers rhodium. In other words, he will prefer the I, which will appreciate more across his monetary time window. Exactly. Yeah. So this is where I was talking about how if you stockpile gold and demand for gold goes up relative to the supply, good for you because you've got the gold. Um, this is the difference between like Bitcoin and Dogecoin and all those other, electronic, you know, currencies. Is good for you if you invest in the ones that everybody catches on to like a fad, because you can kind of like sell them along with doing the exchange things you plan on doing with them anyway. But if you end up, latching onto one as a medium of exchange that everybody, nobody gets into, everybody flees from, and device just crashes like Dogecoin or something, then you're in big trouble, because now you're holding this intermediate resource that nobody wants to trade with anymore. Um, so I think what Moldbug is getting at here is you want to pick an intermediate resource that's valuable now, and you expect to still be a good medium of exchange in the future. And a good proxy for that would be some time measure of appreciation. Because if something's appreciating now, maybe it'll continue to do in the future. Okay. Of course, this has to be adjusted for storage costs and financial returns. If there's a financial market dominated in rhodium, and rather than keeping his rhodium under the mattress, Sven can lend it out for a secure 3% rhodium on rhodium return, this is part of appreciation. If palladium is radioactive and needs to be stored in its expensive lead lined chamber, effectively consuming 2% of its weight every year, the same applies. But even with this 5% difference, if the palladium rhodium exchange rate is rising at 10%, Sven goes with palladium. Yeah, because he'll get more rhodium out of it if he wants to than he's paying in upkeep costs. Even a futures market. Oh, how does he know what the exchange rate will do? He doesn't. Even a futures market cannot solve Sven's problem for him. Futures markets are notoriously bad at predicting exchange rate fluctuations because loan markets simply transpose future price fluctuations onto the present. The gold futures market, for example, cannot predict rises in gold price higher than the cost of borrowing dollars. Otherwise, arbitrageurs can borrow money, buy gold, sell it in future, and collect the difference between the predicted price rise and the dollar interest rates. In fact, this would be a beautiful way to suppress the gold price, if not for that buy gold step. Okay, so the basic idea here, let me try to translate this. If you could predictably tell how much a good was going to appreciate, then you would have every incentive to convert the goods that wouldn't appreciate into the goods that would, and basically pocket the difference. But the paradox with that is if you keep converting goods to goods that will appreciate, um, and everybody kind of starts jumping on that bandwagon, you're going to end up with kind of like a tulip bubble or something, and it will kind of it'll undermine the natural appreciation effects. And so what you have is you have a bunch of speculations, right? Maybe it's going to continue to appreciate, and so speculators pretend it will. Maybe they're wrong, and the bubbles burst, and that's what keeps the whole thing solvent. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. Um, all Sven can do is think. And this is where the game theory comes in. If Sven is thinking rationally, which admittedly is a big if for anyone named Sven, wow, harsh, he will realize that he is not the only Sven in the world. Whatever intermediate good he chooses, someone else will choose it as well. If there's one Sven, there's a herd of Svens. And since buying and selling any good cannot fail to affect its price, i.e., exchange rate against other goods, we have a feedback loop. Yeah, that's what I was trying to describe earlier. The herd selects an intermediate good based on its predicted exchange rate, but the exchange rate cannot be predicted without knowing the herd selection. Problem. Imagine the market for palladium. Before the entry of the herd, since palladium is not being used as an intermediate good, everyone who owns palladium has some actual use for it. Suppose, for simplicity, that this use is destructive. Perhaps palladium is eaten like wheat. It is very easy to describe the pricing of wheat. Wheat is correctly priced when the price is such that the wheat in demand equals wheat supply, and wheat stockpiles neither grow nor shrink. Perhaps you've seen Wall Street stories about commodity markets in which inventories are said to be rising or falling. Commodities traders use these reports to guess where the price at present is too high or too low. If they're right, they profit. If they're wrong, they lose. But why should wheat stockpiles neither grow nor shrink? Because no one wants to stockpile wheat. In other words, because wheat is not a monetary good, for one thing, it doesn't keep. In fact, if wheat was not a seasonal crop, it would probably be produced under modern just-in-supply time chain discipline with almost no stockpile at all. Since it is a seasonal crop, it has some optimal stockpile, but it's certainly not 60 years worth of production. This is why the normal techniques of commodities valuation strike out when applied to monetary goods. They are relying on an assumption that just isn't true. If the size of the stockpile is not controlled, there's no point at which the supply equals demand. Jessica Cross and her ilk are trying to solve for one variable in a two variable equation. They might as well be reading tea leaves. A fellow named Shane McGuire, whose main claim to fame is that he's not a traditional gold bug at all, but actually a state pension fund manager, has just put out a new book with a charmingly blunt title, Buy Gold Now. I haven't read it, but I skimmed a little on Amazon and it looks pretty good. In this interview, he expresses the difficulty well. Any MBA holder who has been taught to value almost any asset hits a stone wall when faced with gold. It pays no dividend or coupon, and without deriving a cash flow, the basis of most assets defined as being financial, there is no conventional way to determine its dollar value. Indeed, except that I would say there is no conventional way to predict the exchange rate between gold and dollars. You cannot calculate it as if gold was a stream of future dollar payments, because it isn't. You cannot calculate it assuming that the gold stockpile needs to converge on a constant, because it doesn't. But Sven, if his IA and RIB are not platinum and rhodium, but gold platinum, I thought he was talking palladium. Anyway,
Yeah,
are
I
not
know. He switched.
are not platinum and rhodium, but gold and dollars, has to compute exactly this number. How in the heck does he do it? Or does he just close his eyes and guess? Let's go back and look at the feedback loop again. First, we need to establish that Sven's problem is indeed, as I had claimed earlier, a coordination game. In other words, Sven's goal is to pick the same intermediate good that everybody else picks. Why? Because of herd effects. There are two cases to consider. In case A, Nitropia has not yet chosen a standardized currency. In case B, it already has. First, case A. Nitropia is just emerging from the pre-monetary equilibrium. All goods in Nitropia, including palladium and rhodium, are priced as industrial commodities, i.e., they are demanded only by direct users. Suddenly, a software upgrade introduces fish, thus motivating the MTP, thus generating a herd of Svens. Let's separate this herd into two strategies by eye color. As Svens have blue eyes, they follow the proper MBA reflexes and diversify, buying equally priced lots of palladium and rhodium. But if they have brown eyes, they only buy rhodium. Who does better? The brown-eyed Svens. Why? Because the MTP has created new demand for both palladium and rhodium. There was no monetary demand before we broke the equilibrium. Now there is. Ceteris paribus, the price must go up. Right. So the idea here is if everybody buys palladium, then you get a bigger network effect from having more palladium. So if you hedge when everybody does this, the hedge is going to cost you. That rhodium is basically empty because nobody bought rhodium. In fact, it is even uglier than this, because if we then relax the eye color constraint, a substantial percentage of blue-eyed Svens are liable to say, the hell with it, and ditch their palladium to buy rhodium, thus shoving the palladium-rhodium ratio even deeper into the dumps. There's only one end of this game. Nor is it the worst. The worst is that before the palladium-rhodium wars end, with the victory of the rhodium bugs, the obliteration of the palladium heads, palladium has its little moment in the sun. Its price too rose above the level at which supply equaled demand. It built a monetary stockpile. And now that palladium has been demonetized, there's no need for any such stockpile, which means that it needs to be worked off, which means that palladium price will eventually fall below its original industrial commodity level. Ouch. Taste that pain, palladium levelers. He's basically describing Bitcoin right now. Monetary competition is definitely not for sissies, at least in terms of the abstract economics. We'll get into the reality in a little bit. There is no stable, inhomogeneous strategy. All the Nash equilibria are Highlander outcomes. There can only be one, but which one? That's the fun. Case B, in which rhodium has already won, confirms our suspicions. Essentially, once there is one monetary standard, there's no need for another. Once Nitropia is on rhodium, anyone who buys palladium is no longer different from anyone who is trying to manipulate any commodities market. In a free market, if you want to buy up a bunch of palladium or wheat oil or FCOJ, and by so doing raise the price, you may do so. But if you want to actually realize your profits, you have to sell at some point, and there's no reason to think you'll have any luck getting out at a higher price than you got in at. This is called the burying of the corpse problem, and a thing of beauty it is. In other words, money is the bubble that doesn't pop. Once rhodium feels like the quickening, any other potential monetary standard is at an incurable disadvantage because its adherents are mere manipulators. Sooner or later, they'll get tired and let their guard down, and rhodium will take their heads. But rhodium itself cannot pop. There can only be one, and there has to be at least one, and that's money. So, going over this in basic terms, it's like the dollar versus Bitcoin. The Bitcoin had its time. It rose up really, really, really high. Eventually, the Bitcoin bubble popped and people got tired and just kind of like dumped all their Bitcoin. Now it's going up again. We'll see what happens this time. Um, but so far, the dollar is, quote, the one Highlander currency he's talking about. And Bitcoin, this also has to do with like that Sam Brinkman guy, all these other, electronic currencies. It's all a bunch of manipulation. I'm not an expert on monetary history, but my general impression is that, well, until the late 19th century, both gold and silver were monetary metals. Places and times in which gold and silver were circulated amicably were rare. For example, China and India were generally silver areas, whereas patches of Europe fluctuated between silver and gold. Since Gresham's law will drive one of the two out if the ratio is fixed, since distributing a floating exchange rate quotes to every cash register was not exactly a practical technology, and since the non-circulating good money was generally exported to a region where it was a current medium of exchange, it was hard to avoid any other result. In the Victorian era, however, the financial system became global and gold crushed silver, much as described above, leading to a worldwide, if very imperfect, gold standard. Silver holders got the shaft. Ouch. In retrospect, if the US had gone to free coinage of silver instead of walking the yellow brick road to the cross of gold, we might not have some of the troubles we have today. But wait, we have imported an implicit assumption. Why does Sven have to pick a precious metal? What makes gold, silver, platinum, palladium, rhodium precious? And why does this medium of intertemporal exchange have to be metal at all? Well, it obviously doesn't. Most of us store most of our assets in artificial currencies or assets producing flows of the same stocks, bonds, subprime AAA CDOs, etc. Clearly, defining Sven's problem as a choice of one of the five major precious metals makes it far too easy. Nor have we described the factors that govern competition between the metals. We know that I has to be storable. Salmon are out, definitely out. So let's start from there. Suppose our herd of Sven chooses some other common industrial product which is storable, let's say axes. How will axes do against rhodium? Can Atropia somehow get onto the axe standard, and if so, will it last? In fact, axes cannot be used stably as money. The problem is that an axe, as an industrial product, cannot be stably priced above the cost of making an axe. Probably, as our herd of Sven swarms into the axe market, there will be some hystereses as the existing axe makers struggle to catch up with the new demand, but catch up they will. After the shock is absorbed, axes will experience no appreciation whatsoever. Moreover, when the Svens flood out of the axes into some good that actually can sustain monetary appreciation, such as rhodium, the affair will go down in history as a horrifying axe bubble. As with palladium, but much worse, the landscape will be littered with rusted out axe factories and people will be using axes as doorstops, tire irons, etc. What is the difference between mining rhodium and making an axe? The difference is that you can make as many axes as you want, and it is still just as easy to make more. Rhodium, or any precious metal, can sustain monetary appreciation because its supply is restricted to diminishing returns. There it is. That's where I knew he was going from the very beginning. This is the appreciation part. Appreciation causes the stockpile to increase, but as the stockpile increases, the easily mined deposits are mined out. There is no reason to think that the price will ever go high enough to preclude all new production, but there's no reason to think it can't either. Imagine if today's gold price increased by a factor of 10. Would it increase gold production? It absolutely would. Perhaps the gold dilution rate might even get up to 5%, meaning 7,500 tons produced per year. Although, if you know the gold industry, this is hard to imagine. Higher prices would also stimulate new gold discovery, and gold underground is future gold. It is priced into the gold market through the stocks of companies who own mining rights, and this certainly must affect any dilution rate. Still, however, gold at 10K per ounce or even 100K per ounce would not come even close to looking like an axe bubble. In fact, I doubt that either of these astronomical prices could get gold to the present dilution rate of the dollar. As I discussed here, there's no precise way to measure the number of dollars in the world, but perhaps 15% a year is a good rough estimate of the dilution rate. This number is very, very, very high for a currency. Imagine if 20,000 tons of gold could be mined every year. It would basically have to involve some kind of alien earth-moving technology. And how many years could you sustain it for? Our first order criteria for Sven is do what everyone else is doing. Dilution rates are our best second order criteria for figuring out what everyone else is going to do. When predicting future exchange rates between rhodium and palladium, with the ceteris paribus assumption that industrial criteria will not affect price ratio, our first order concern is the quantity of savings that will flow into each metal. Since monetary demanders are not interested in the good itself, they purchase by value, not by weight, volume, etc., we can think of their bars of rhodium as shares in Rhodium Inc. In other words, what they have bought is a fraction of the global rhodium stockpile. New mining increases that stockpile. It obviously does not increase the size of your bars. Thus, if we discount industrial demand entirely, dilution is equivalent to evaporation. If the rhodium stockpile grows by 10%, ceteris paribus, is as if 10% of your rhodium evaporated into thin air, or as if storage expenses consume 10% of its weight. See, that's not necessarily true. It depends on demand. If production grew by 10%, but demand grew by 50%, then it'll be as if your bars grew in size because more people want bars than bars are being produced, even if production is going up. And this is the part that people don't seem to understand when looking at inflation, anti-inflation, and so on. Even if we're printing like 15% more dollars every year, what matters is how much demand for dollars is going up. If demand for dollars is going up 20% because Africa is industrializing and so on and so on and so forth, then we may be underprinting dollars to facilitate all the global transactions we want, which involve dollars. So only looking at the supply part of the puzzle is a huge problem, and it's one of the main ticks of people who are obsessed with the gold standard. I'll never understand it. Okay. These second order factors, like positive investment returns, help drive the herd's choice of currency. Is a 10% dilution rate sufficient to convince a herd to abandon an existing successful currency? What about 15%? I don't know. Ask Dr. Bernanke. If there is any numerical procedure for predicting monetary herd behavior, I'm certainly unaware of it. However, factors such as dilution rate need to be evaluated not just in the present, but along the path that leads to currency fixation. For example, if it really would be practical to extract gold from seawater at 10K an ounce, which it wouldn't, gold would not be a viable global currency. If the entire global financial system migrated onto gold, prices would certainly exceed 10K per ounce. Therefore, gold would have no possibility of winning the currency competition. It would have no end game, and anyone holding it now should probably sell. On the other hand, gold's enormous stockpile makes it far more viable as a global currency than any other precious metal stockpiles. Oh, any other precious metal. Stockpiles of the platinum group metals, platinum, palladium, rhodium, and the minor metals osmium, iridium, and ruthenium are much lower, as are silver inventories. This implies much more dramatic price responses to an influx of savings, but it also implies much more dilution rate produced by the influx. I doubt any mineable metal can exhibit any predictable response to a price increase of 4 or 5 orders of magnitude. Thus, PGMs and probably silver as well do not have a clear path to currency domination. Not that gold's path is in any way, shape, or form clear, but it is much clearer than anything platinum has to offer, and since there can only be one, clarity counts. At this point, we've reached a level of abstract precious metals theorizing that is certainly well beyond anything any market is likely to assimilate anytime soon. Herd strategies only work if the herd actually understands and applies them, especially considering Wall Street's almost tribal antipathy to gold, and gold bugs, perhaps Shane McGuire, is a harbinger of a trend, but if so, he's a very, very early. We are simply getting ahead of ourselves. Despite the Highlander logic, I own both gold and silver, and if I had a convenient way to buy it, I'd pick up some platinum as well. At present, Wall Street is experiencing a generalized surge of savings into commodities. As investors become more educated on the subject, this may sharpen into a generalized precious metal surge. By the time you see any kind of game theoretic decoupling between metals, it will be quite late in the game. Also, gold has a significant disadvantage, which McGuire mentions in his interview. It is the only metal which governments have substantial stocks of. More on this in a minute. It's time to consider the metals' great competitors, the national or fiat currencies. Fiat is in fact the correct technical word, but as a result of repetition by Ron Paul and the like, it is starting to acquire pejorative connotations. Unfortunately, this will rub off on the complainers rather than the currencies. Power hath its privileges. Natural National and artificial are both good words without any strong connotations. You can also just say paper, which is no more than the truth. And if you like to wax nostalgic for the old Constitution, this essay by George Bancroft may put some fire in your belly. Now we understand what money is. It's easy to see what the national currencies are. They are artificial, precious metal substitutes. Government always dreamed of alchemy, and now they have it. Like so many youthful fantasies, the reality is not as once imagined, but it is reality nonetheless, and we have to live with it. Probably the most interesting fact about paper money, and certainly the least understood, is the gradual nature of the transition from metal to paper. Not since the 18th century, in the heyday of the Amsterdamsche Wisselbank, has there been any major financial system on an undiluted metal currency. The so called classical gold standard of the 19th century, really the Bank of England standard, was at all times heavily stretched with paper, like bread in a meatloaf. The reason we no longer have anything called the gold standard is that by 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, the connection had become so attenuated as to be absurd. It was less a meatloaf than a sort of meat flavored Wonder Bread. How do you stretch a gold standard? Easily. Print pieces of paper that say 1 per 1 gram of gold. Compel your subjects to treat them as equivalent to gold. This is the original meaning of legal tender, a concept which is quite confusing without the historical background. If you like, you can back these notes with something, typically debts due to the future, perhaps with a small amount of actual gold to permit redemption, or you can just accept them in payment on taxes. The combination of term transformation and legal tender power effectively allows an infinite amount of virtual gold to import itself from the future via a Rube Goldberg machine so complex that not 1 out of 20 of your subjects has any hope of understanding it. Pure paper, without any fond memories of the barbaric relic, is a considerable improvement on the old Baghotian trickery. It is actually the first step toward gold. It is very hard to turn a meatloaf back into a steak. It is much easier to restore a true gold standard with no musical chairs, financial time travel, or other wacky hanky panky, simply by migrating away from paper to gold. Throughout history, paper money has been a cyclical phenomenon, and simply irredeemable paper is the unskippable last step of the cycle. As Wikipedia puts it, the history of money consists of 3 phases: commodity money, in which actual valuable objects are bartered, then representative money, in which paper notes, often called certificates, are used to represent real commodities stored elsewhere, and finally fiat money, in which paper notes are backed only by the trader's full faith and credit in the government, in particular by its acceptability for payments of debts to the government, usually taxes. This is Whig history in one sentence, and real history phase 3 wraps back around. Clearly, the fact that paper money has no intrinsic utility is no barrier to its success or stability. In any model of spontaneous currency standardization, whether laws or mangers, there must be some original demand for the currency. But any government worthy of the name can create demand where there is no utility. Simply order your subjects to pay their taxes in your national currency. If they don't, arrest them. I think it's very clear that if there was a fixed stockpile of dollars in the world, as I propose in this post, the unbacked paper dollar would outcompete all other currencies, natural or artificial, in very short order. Even holders of euros and yen would move their savings onto that dollar. These currencies would depreciate rapidly and collapse. So would gold, which would become an industrial metal and quite a cheap one, thanks to its enormous stockpile. In theory, the dollar is certainly capable of reversing its present losing trend against gold. In fact, it pulled it off this just a trick in 1980 under the leadership of the brilliant Paul Volcker. Mr. Volcker is still with us, and if you start hearing noises about bringing him back, worry. Gold prices declined almost continuously for 2 decades after his victory. But don't worry too much, because the Fed does not have the weapons it had in 1980, the main one being 20% interest rates, which went quite a ways toward both ending monetary dilution of the 70s and compensating dollars holders for what was left of it. Unbelievable as it may sound, the US economy today is a shadow of what it was in the 70s. As we saw in this latest cycle, it is so debt laden that it cannot stand 5% rates, even though these are at least negative 5% when you adjust for dilution. 20% was bad enough in the 80s. Today you'll see feral children gnaw each other's bones off in the streets. Okay, I gotta stop here. This I don't understand how he gets from, okay, if you had 5% interest and 10% dilution in the currency, that's like 10% more dollars are printed worldwide. If those 10% aren't circulated into the money markets parallel to where you're drawing interest, that 10% means nothing to you. If you print 10% more dollars and they're all circulating around Africa, doing absolutely nothing with the monetary base of the United States, they're just allowing Africa to facilitate basic transactions for oil or US exports or something like this, then that 10% printed has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on your cost of living or your interests. And this is something I just cannot beat into people's heads. I cannot get them to understand it to save my life, and it's frustrating. Okay. Oh, you gonna say something?
Yeah, it's sort of like what we talked about. Like, why haven't we had hyperinflation yet? And it's because all the dollars circulating around the world haven't come home yet.
Exactly.
Once
Yeah.
they do, yeah, then we'll get the hyperinflation.
If either somehow they all come home or somehow just nobody wants the dollars anymore.
Well, yeah, that too.
Yeah. Because what's really backing us isn't just the fact that that the dollars we're printing are being used elsewhere, not interacting with our basically monetary ecosystem. It's like, yeah, we're all dollars, but we're all different dollar markets. The other thing too is the reason they want those dollars is to consume our stuff. They want to consume our Hollywood products. They want to buy into our stock market. You know, Ben Bernanke talked about the global savings glut back in the 2000s. So they want to buy our stocks. They want to buy our IP, computer software, stuff like that. They want our machines for industrializing. If they discard our dollars, they probably want somebody else's currency. Maybe they get in on the BRICS dollar. And so they want Chinese machinery, Chinese software, Russian machinery, Russian software. And so that will mean like um not just the collapse of the supply demand equilibrium for dollars, which is bad. It also means what the dollars are a proxy for, which is their demand for the global demand for our stuff. They get dollars to buy our stuff with our currency. That's the point. And so once that all goes down, basically it means our exports tank.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In theory, if a government cannot control a coordination game, such as currency selection, it is not much of a government. Indeed, when you buy gold, this is precisely the proposition in which you are investing. The Western governments of 2008 are red giant states. They are as large as they have ever been, but also as weak as they have ever been. Why is the dollar weak? Why, when the US is running epic trade deficits, are interest rates going down rather than up? Why is the suggestion of a note supply limited by statute a policy once followed quite effectively by this very same government, an impractical curiosity which does not represent any real threat to gold holders? Why, for that matter, in a time of currency crisis, are Americans allowed to hold gold and silver at all, especially through incredibly convenient instruments such as the precious metals, ETFs, gold, and silver, which anyone with a portfolio can use to switch their savings on a fully backed bullion? Why is a senior fellow at what Murray Rothbard used to call the Rockefeller World Empire appearing on NPR and touting digital gold currencies? This, I feel, is the most important question for anyone considering buying gold. Why moon the bull? Why taunt the tiger? FDR faced combined currency and banking run in 1933. He leaped the fence, broke half the financial contracts in the country, and took the medal back. It was illegal for Americans to own monetary metals for the next 40 years. A very simple case of attack and counterattack. Normal politics at its finest. Could it happen again? Legally? Sure. And yet something feels different. The answer is just that FDR is no longer in charge. In fact, no one is. Well, I'll tell you what feels different. I mean, back when FDR, we ostensibly did have a gold-backed dollar. And so when you're trying to procure goods during a war and other things, and so you need to have you need to use global dollars to facilitate a war effort and other things. You have to increase the circulation of dollars to make the currency more global. Well, that means you have to have enough gold to back the currency. That's the problem with gold backed currencies. You can't print more paper to make the currency more liquid and tradable without getting the gold supply to back the paper. Well, if you're having trouble getting gold supply on demand because supply is precarious, what do? You have to get gold wherever you can get it. That's what's different. There's actually a need for government to take gold from people to put in the treasuries to back the paper that doesn't exist now because we're not gold backed paper.
Also, nobody's in charge, Logos.
We also nobody's in charge, but even assuming we did have some Machiavellian FDR 2.0 in charge, he doesn't need to do this because
Yeah.
we can make our currency globally tradable and liquid without needing more gold in our treasuries to, quote, back the paper. That's what's different. That's exactly what's different.
Yeah.
Okay, no one observing the Western government today can fail to be struck by a massive sense of sleepwalking. There is no unified consciousness or purpose behind their actions. Yeah, there is. Absolutely, there is. Each of their decisions is an atom unto itself, made through an almost ritualized process by a large number of very intelligent, talented, and ambitious people, whose abilities tend to cancel each other out almost perfectly, leaving nothing but a chilling bureaucratic continuity. This is getting tiring. Okay. The modern regime is unable to take basic defensive actions against an impending currency collapse because it is unable to take any kind of thoughtful action at all. He's going to have to describe the currency collapse. Like in 2008, what was the impending currency collapse?
I mean, there was a housing collapse.
Yeah, there was a housing collapse, but the problem with the housing collapse is the problem of physical land and land development compared to mass immigration and increasing supply. There's a physical cause for the housing collapse. In 2008, what is the cause for the currency collapse? He hasn't actually gone into it yet. It's not exactly clear. It's also not clear how the government taking a bunch of gold will help the currency collapse. Like nothing makes sense. He's just kind of saying things.
Yep.
Um okay, where is it? Here it is. Because it decided in the 1970s that gold and silver were industrial commodities, it legalized their holding as a kind of gesture of power. There were those in 1971 who thought the gold price would actually decline when Nixon closed the gold window because now the demonetization was official. But in the 70s, Washington still had men like Paul Volcker, a financial atheist with a true gravitas and real personal authority. Volcker's austerity measures were something now unthinkable in Washington, a judgment call. He decided to restrict the quantity of dollars and let rates do what they had to do. They did, and it worked. A kind of last grasp of Carlylean government, a Roman ambush of the Huns, doomed perhaps, but still brilliant. Professor Bernanke is just that, a professor. He's a specialist in framework invented to employ specialists. Computer science is full of these research empires, full of sound and fury signifying nothing. Detaching your little subfield from reality is the easiest thing in the world. Reconnecting is almost impossible. First, you'd have to admit on your grant application that you've been studying something other than reality. If that's hard in Berkeley, try Washington. Google News does not show me a single recent mention of the word austerity, at least not used by an American with reference to American politics. Imagine if Barack Obama went around the country talking not of change, but of austerity. Yes, we can tighten our belts. Impossible. He is more likely to invade France. So much for the Washington Consensus. The custodians of the post 1945 financial architecture, such as they are, have one weapon which they may still be able to deploy. This is their gold reserves, officially about 30,000 tons. Central banks hold gold so they can exchange it for their artificial currencies, changing the exchange rate in their favor, i.e., so they can dump it on the market and trash the price. This is simply a generalization of redeemable currency, in which all the discretion is transferred to the bank. It is not a conspiracy, it is normal. However, it is not at all clear that official gold reserve figures are anywhere near accurate. IMF guidelines have long encouraged central banks to report gold that is loaned or deposited on a single line with actual monetary gold. In other words, what the bank actually owns is not gold, but an obligation from another party to deliver gold. The real gold has almost certainly been sold, and the counterparty, typically a large domestic bank or foreign central bank, is, at least in theory, naked short, and not feeling too good about it, at least not these days. This practice was a great way to make money in the 90s when the gold price was declining, and in fact, may have been a major cause of that decline. At this point, it's somewhat embarrassing. James Turk recently discovered that USG is in on the game, which doesn't look good at all. The gold lending situation, for no reason I can discern besides basic accounting honesty, something USG is actually quite good at as it plays into the natural CYA response, appears to be heading slowly toward a correction. If this actually happens, it will be very interesting to see how much gold is actually left. However, there's also a large market in gold options and other derivatives. A central bank has many weapons. However, we keep running into the same problem, the red giant state. If you assume that USG and its allies are ruthless and Machiavellian, they have many ways to defend their currencies. But if USG and its allies were ruthless and Machiavellian, they would not have a problem like this in the first place. Take the recently proposed IMF gold sales. The gold to be possibly sold will not simply be dumped on the market with an auction a la Gordon Brown. No, it will be shoehorned into the existing central bank gold agreement, under which European central banks sell 500 tons a year. Nominally, this is a restriction to avoid massive sales that would depress the gold price. Perhaps this was even the original point. At present, however, it appears to be an obligation to prevent that price from reaching escape velocity, an obligation onerous enough that the Europeans would not mind shuffling some of it off on the IMF. And of course, no one even begins to admit that managing the gold price is the point. Perhaps they are even sincere about this. Why shouldn't they be? Why shouldn't the policies that once were ruthless and Machiavellian have become, after decades of the system believing its own PR, mere force of habit? If the central banks were really managing the gold price, don't you think they'd be doing a better job of it? As I recently suggested on this RGE thread, there's a simple way to understand the gold market. Think of gold as an artificial currency. Imagine it's the currency of a small European country, which we call Goldenstein. Every year for the last 5 years, the Goldenstein euro has appreciated by about 20% against the dollar, and that was before the crisis. If we annualize 2008 so far, it's more like a million trillion percent. I exaggerate slightly. This means, of course, that the dollar has lost 20% a year against the euro. Now imagine that you are doing customer outreach for some Wall Street firm that is trying to appeal to Goldensteiners. Specifically, you are trying to persuade them to invest in dollars or stocks or bonds or any financial asset which produces revenue in dollars. How would you pitch that? Now imagine that you're a bank in Goldenstein. You're trying to persuade foreigners to invest in your small but happy country. How would you advertise the service? Would you even have to? Where would it stop? Why would it stop? How would it stop? Of course, there is no Goldenstein. That is, there's no sovereign country whose goal it is to defend and promote the gold standard. There is no RO, just gold itself. The economics are all the same, but there is no army, navy, or air force. Goldenstein may be small, but at least it has a police force with a couple of Glocks and some old bulletproof vests. Gold has nothing at all. And yet gold, as we've seen, is an existential threat to the greatest military power in the history of the world. No one whose legal and financial arms reach everywhere, no corporation can even think about making USG its enemy. What can it do about gold? Anything if it wants. What should it be doing? Something, definitely. What is it doing? Pretty much squat as I can tell. Perhaps the god has abandoned Antony.
Well, there you go, Logos.
Wow.
What did you say at the beginning of this? This is going to hurt.
It started off pretty good, and then it went downhill pretty fast.
I don't even know. What do we say?
What do we say? People who are not into fiat currencies are too fixated on the supply part of the currency equation, and they're not fixated on the demand part of the supply equation. If the US dollar collapses, it's because global demand for the dollar collapses. It's not because gold is great or something. It's because the world, in rebellion to the US government, imperial policy, foreign policy, whatever you want to call it, says we're going to trade amongst ourselves in our own currency, in our own way, and you're going to play ball or your global trade system collapses. That's what collapses the dollar. Right there. You don't have to appeal to all this crazy Austrian woo. The collapse of the US demand for the dollar collapses exports, collapses the US economy. That's all you need to say.
All right. And the one we read before this, democracy not found in history. Well, there you go. We didn't get the historical analysis. Now, did we?
I still don't know what the hell that had to do with democracy, except other than
I don't know
corporation
either.
something and popular will. The system is both spontaneous, but also follows the will of the people, but also imposes the will of the people. It's all three things at once.
But it also has no leader.
It does exactly. It has no leader that follows the will of the people, and it has no leader that the people can impress their will upon. It spontaneously evolves leaderless, while of course, taking the opinions of the people and informing the same.
How did this guy ever build an audience?
I don't know. Well, he's got an audience of quasi-libertarians, basically. That's it. That's his audience. Quasi-libertarians that think corporations are great and everything would be great if it was a corporation.
Okay. That's it. All right, guys. That's all we got for today. This is Ty Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.